Why would a German shepherd mother refuse to leave the rotting porch of a house no one had lived in for decades? When former Navy SEAL Caleb Morgan arrived in the Georgia woods, he expected silence, isolation, and a place where no one would ask anything of him. Instead, he found the protective mother hiding beneath the porch with two tiny puppies, one restless, one strangely focused on the ground below. Then the cracked iron bell above the doorway rang without wind. Why had the stream behind the house suddenly gone quiet? What was moving beneath the soil? And why had the woman who once lived there warned the town about the same silence 30 years earlier? This is a fictional story created for storytelling purposes. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. Late spring had settled gently over the Blue Ridge Mountains, bringing warm rain, pale morning mist, and the smell of pine to the wooded ridges north of Ellijay, Georgia. The forest appeared peaceful from the narrow gravel road, but Caleb Morgan had learned long ago that quiet places were not always safe places. What happened to a man who had spent most of his life obeying commands when he no longer trusted any voice? Not his commander's, not his family's, and least of all, his own. At 47, Caleb still carried the unmistakable build of a former Navy SEAL. He stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, with broad shoulders, strong forearms, and the controlled posture of someone who entered every room already measuring the exits. His dark brown hair was cut short, with silver beginning to show above both temples. A neatly trimmed beard sharpened the angles of his weathered face, while a pale scar beneath his left jaw hinted at a past he rarely discussed. Caleb's gray-blue eyes were observant without being welcoming. Around strangers he was polite, restrained, and difficult to know. Around people who cared about him, he often became even more distant. For nearly 4 years after leaving active service, Caleb had worked as an instructor at a private security facility in Virginia. He taught younger men how to remain calm under pressure, how to read a room, and how to recognize danger before danger announced itself. Then, during a crowded training exercise 3 months earlier, a metal barricade had fallen behind him. The crash had mixed with shouting, whistles, and the sharp echo of boots against concrete. Caleb had turned too quickly, shoved a trainee against a wall, and held him there before realizing the frightened young man was not an enemy. No one had been seriously hurt. The trainee had accepted Caleb's apology. The company director had offered paid leave instead of dismissal. None of that had mattered. Caleb had seen fear in the young man's face, and something inside him had closed like a locked door. He sold his small Virginia apartment, placed most of his belongings in storage, and purchased an abandoned farmhouse on 13 acres outside Ellijay. The price was low because the roof leaked, the porch leaned dangerously to one side, and the nearest neighbor lived nearly 2 miles away. Caleb told his older sister, Linda Morgan, that he wanted a restoration project and a fresh beginning. Linda was 52, 5 years older than Caleb, and one of the few people who still challenged him without apology. She was a tall, narrow-shouldered woman with fair skin, soft brown eyes, and chestnut hair cut in a practical bob that had begun to gray near the ears. Years of working as a public school counselor had made Linda patient with frightened children and impatient with adults who hid behind carefully chosen words. After their father died suddenly when Caleb was 17, Linda had helped hold the family together while Caleb learned to cope by becoming useful, disciplined, and almost impossible to comfort. "You're not buying a house," Linda had said over the phone. "You're buying distance." Caleb had looked at the photographs of the forest property on his laptop and answered, "I'm buying work." That was not a denial, and both of them knew it. The farmhouse stood at the end of a neglected trail beneath white pines and tulip poplars. Its gray wooden siding had faded unevenly, green moss covered parts of the shingled roof, and one upstairs window remained open like a dark, watchful eye. A cracked iron bell hung from a weathered beam above the front porch. Rust had eaten into the metal, and the rope beneath it had nearly rotted through. Caleb parked his truck beside a fallen fence and stepped out with a brown leather duffel in one hand. The forest smelled of wet leaves and old wood. Somewhere beyond the house, a narrow creek moved through the trees with a low, steady murmur. He had taken only 3 steps toward the porch when a deep growl stopped him. Beneath the collapsed right corner of the porch lay an adult German Shepherd mother. The dog was approximately 4 years old, though hardship made the lean body appear older. Black and tan fur clung unevenly to visible ribs, and a pale scar crossed the left shoulder beneath a patch of missing hair. The upright ears were rigid, the brown eyes bright with exhaustion and suspicion. The mother dog did not rise immediately. Instead, the front legs shifted beneath the chest while the body remained positioned between Caleb and 2 small shapes hidden deeper in the shadows. Caleb slowly lowered the duffel. "I see you," he said. The German Shepherd mother showed her teeth. One of the puppies crawled into view. The tiny German Shepherd was about 7 weeks old, with oversized paws, fluffy black and tan fur, and one ear trying unsuccessfully to stand upright. Curiosity overcame caution almost immediately. The puppy sniffed Caleb's bag, pawed at the leather, and squeezed halfway through the open zipper before Caleb could react. The second puppy remained beneath the porch. This German Shepherd puppy was slightly smaller, with a darker face, folded ears, and wide brown eyes that studied rather than approached. Instead of watching Caleb, the quieter puppy lowered the head and pressed one ear against the old porch boards. The mother dog gave a warning bark. The adventurous puppy tumbled backward out of the duffel and hurried behind the mother's front legs. Caleb had dealt with working dogs during his service, but this was different. Trained military dogs understood commands and predictable routines. The German Shepherd mother beneath the porch understood hunger, protection, and the possibility that every approaching hand might take something away. Caleb recognized that kind of thinking. He did not find the resemblance comforting. He returned to the truck, opened a package of dried meat, and filled a dented camping bowl with water. He placed both items several yards from the porch, then backed away. The mother dog waited until Caleb entered the house before creeping forward. Even then, she ate with the body angled toward the puppies, swallowing quickly while checking the doorway after every few bites. Inside, Caleb found dust, squirrel nests, cracked plaster, and furniture covered in yellowed sheets. The main floor was dirty but structurally sound. He moved through each room with a flashlight, noting damaged boards, broken locks, and areas where rain had reached the walls. A person might have called the place lonely. Caleb preferred the word manageable. 20 miles away, in a small brick library near Elijah's Courthouse Square, June Foster sat beneath a green reading lamp surrounded by old newspapers and county maps. June was 72. Short and sturdy, with warm brown skin, tightly curled silver hair, and reading glasses suspended from a bright red cord. A retired postal clerk, she possessed the kind of memory that could attach names to roads, marriages, floods, and old disagreements long after everyone else had forgotten the details. June could be generous, but never delicate. She believed tact was useful mainly when the truth required better packaging. For 6 months, June had been reconstructing the history of the 1992 flood that damaged farms and homes along the lower valley. A file connected to the abandoned farmhouse was incomplete. Weather logs, handwritten measurements, and several pages of testimony had disappeared. The missing records belonged to Evelyn Bellamy, the former owner of Caleb's new house. Evelyn had been a tall, severe woman with iron-gray hair, sun-lined skin, and a voice that rarely softened even when softness might have helped. She had lived alone in the forest and watched the weather with almost religious attention. Town residents remembered Evelyn ringing the iron bell before dangerous storms. After the flood, many accused her of spreading panic without preventing the destruction. Years later, the argument still lingered beneath polite conversation. That evening, Caleb spread his sleeping bag across the dusty front room. He had decided to call an animal rescue center the next morning. The German Shepherd mother and 2 puppies needed food, veterinary care, and a proper home. Caleb told himself that arranging those things would be responsible. He did not admit that responsibility was easier when it ended with handing someone over to another person. Outside, the mother dog settled beneath the porch with both puppies pressed against her body. The lively puppy chewed the edge of Caleb's abandoned duffel strap. The quieter puppy placed one ear against the wooden floor again. Night covered the forest. The air grew still. Then the cracked iron bell above the porch sounded once. The note was low, blunt, and strangely heavy. Caleb sat upright. There was no wind. The German shepherd mother did not look toward the bell. She rose immediately, placed her body in front of the two puppies, and stared toward the creek behind the house. Only then did Caleb notice what had changed. The creek had stopped making sound. Morning came damp and silver over the Blue Ridge foothills, with low clouds caught between the ridges and drops of water clinging to every pine needle. Caleb Morgan had slept for less than 3 hours. Each time he closed his eyes, he heard the cracked bell again, a single iron note in perfectly still air, and then remembered the mother German shepherd staring toward the suddenly silent creek. At first light, Caleb walked behind the farmhouse with a flashlight and found the creek bed wet but strangely subdued. A thin ribbon of water still moved between the stones, too shallow to create the steady murmur he had heard when he arrived. Fallen leaves had gathered against exposed roots, yet there was no obvious obstruction. Caleb stood there longer than necessary, irritated by his own uncertainty. In the service, uncertainty had required action. In civilian life, it often required patience, which Caleb considered a poorly designed substitute. He returned to the house and called the nearest animal rescue organization. A tired female voice answered after several rings. Melissa Carter, the rescue coordinator, was a woman in her early 40s whom Caleb could picture from her brisk, practical manner before she briefly described the station at the shelter. 32 dogs, 11 cats, 2 injured goats, and only 4 full-time employees. Melissa had a low voice, roughened by long days, and an apologetic habit of exhaling before delivering bad news. Years earlier, she explained, a tornado had destroyed the first shelter where she worked, and since then she had become the kind of person who never promised space that did not exist. "We can put you on the intake list," Melissa said. 2 weeks if we get adoptions, 3 if we don't. I'm not equipped for 3 dogs. Do they have shade? Yes. Water? Yes. Are the puppies nursing? Caleb looked through the cracked window. Beneath the porch, the 2 puppies pressed against their mother's belly while she watched the house. Yes. Then for today, you're more equipped than we are. Caleb disliked the answer because it was reasonable. He agreed to keep the dogs temporarily, wrote down the rescue number, and immediately established rules, as though rules might transform inconvenience into order. The dogs would remain outside. Food would be placed beside the porch twice each day. No animal would enter the farmhouse, touch his tools, or take anything that did not belong to it. Caleb spoke the rules aloud while standing near the porch. The mother German shepherd regarded him with narrowed brown eyes. The lively puppy sneezed. The quieter puppy continued listening to the boards beneath its paws. Caleb had addressed rooms full of armed trainees with less skepticism directed at him. The first rule lasted 17 minutes. Caleb was sorting clean clothes from his duffel when the lively puppy appeared in the doorway carrying one of his gray socks. The tiny German shepherd's oversized paws slipped on the dusty floor, but the puppy continued forward with enormous confidence, the sock dragging between its legs like captured game. Caleb steps toward it. The puppy spun around, collided with a chair leg, recovered without dignity, and fled onto the porch. "Bring that back." The puppy looked over one shoulder and ran faster. When Caleb returned inside, he found the quieter puppy curled beneath the kitchen table. The small, dark face rested between 2 front paws, one folded ear pressed close to the floorboards. Unlike the other puppy, this one did not appear playful. Its eyes moved toward Caleb, then downward again, as though whatever existed beneath the house deserved more attention than he did. Caleb crouched, but did not reach beneath the table. Outside. The puppy blinked.
That wasn't complicated.
A movement near the back door interrupted him. The mother German shepherd stood with one of Caleb's leather work clubs in her mouth. She had taken it from the toolbox beside the wall. Caleb rose carefully. The dog backed away, body tense, then turned and ran around the side of the house. Caleb followed, partly because the glove was nearly new and partly because the dog's movement did not resemble play. The mother crossed the wet yard, past the weakened creek, and entered a corridor of mountain laurel beneath the trees. The lively puppy followed immediately, still dragging the stolen sock. After a moment, the quieter puppy emerged from the house and trotted after them. The path descended gently through the woods. Caleb noticed old stones arranged in 2 parallel lines beneath vines and moss. At first, he assumed they were the remains of a boundary wall. Farther down the slope, the stones narrowed into a shallow channel. The mother dog stopped beside a mound of wet leaves and dropped Caleb's glove. She sniffed the ground, turned twice, and began digging. Caleb moved closer. Beneath the leaves lay the edge of a stone-lined drainage ditch, perhaps 3 feet wide, running diagonally across the slope. Roots had broken through its sides and years of soil had filled much of its depth. The ditch ended at an old metal pipe set into an earthen bank. Only the upper curve of the pipe remained visible. Packed clay, stones, and tangled roots sealed nearly the entire opening. The mother German shepherd dug beside it, throwing mud backward between her hind legs. The lively puppy attempted to help, mostly by biting a root and falling over. The quieter puppy did not dig. It stepped onto the damp earth beside the pipe, lowered its head, and pressed one ear to the ground. Caleb watched the puppy become completely still. He placed one hand against the exposed metal. It was cold and faintly damp, but he felt no vibration. Perhaps a raccoon had crawled inside. Perhaps the dogs smelled a buried carcass. There were ordinary explanations for most things, and Caleb had spent years surviving by choosing ordinary explanations until evidence demanded otherwise. He took a folded survey map from his jacket, marked the drainage pipe's location with a pencil, and recovered his glove. The mother allowed him to pick it up, but kept her body between him and the puppies. By the time they returned to the farmhouse, an older blue station wagon was parked beside Caleb's truck. June Foster stood on the porch holding a peach pie covered with a checked cloth. Her short silver curls were damp from the mist, and a bright red cord held her reading glasses against a green cardigan. At 72, June had the compact, sturdy build of someone who had spent decades carrying mail bags up steep driveways and refusing assistance from people half her age.
"You must be Caleb Morgan,"
she said. "You must be lost." "No. Lost people usually hesitate before entering private property." June stepped through the open doorway without being invited and placed the pie on the kitchen counter. The lively puppy followed her as if pies had legal authority. June looked beneath the table, where the quieter puppy resumed its listening position, then toward the mother standing in the doorway. "You bought a house and inherited a committee," June observed. "They're temporary. So are most governments. They still leave a mess." Caleb did not smile, though something in his face nearly did. June explained that she had been researching the 1992 flood and had learned the farmhouse had changed hands. When Caleb mentioned the stone channel and blocked pipe, her humor disappeared. She asked him to show her. At the sight, June brushed vines away from the stones with the end of her walking stick. She said Evelyn Bellamy had once mapped a drainage network running from the upper ridge toward the valley. Evelyn measured rainfall, marked changes in creek depth, and recorded small movements in the hillside after storms. The system had never appeared on modern county maps because parts of it crossed private property and had been abandoned after the flood. "People thought she was obsessed," June said. "Was she? Being right about one thing doesn't make a person reasonable about everything." Caleb studied the blocked pipe. "Could this explain the creek?" "It might explain part of it, or it might be 30 feet of rust leading nowhere." June disliked Caleb's clipped answers and told him so. Caleb replied that complete sentences did not improve incomplete evidence. June looked at him for several seconds, then said he spoke like a man submitting reports to people who were no longer listening. The remark landed closer than Caleb wanted. He turned away. Before leaving, June stood beside the blocked pipe while mist gathered in her silver hair. "A creek isn't dangerous because it makes noise," she said. "It's dangerous when the water is still there, but no longer moving where it should." A deep sound rolled beneath the earth. It was not thunder. The sky remained quiet. The ground seemed to shift with a long, muffled groan as though something heavy had moved far below the roots. The quiet puppy jerked its head up and stumbled backward. Caleb felt a vibration faintly through the soles of his boots. For the first time, the sound belonged to more than a dog's instinct or an old woman's story. Caleb heard it too. 2 clear days followed the mist, warming the Blue Ridge foothills and drying the mud around the abandoned farmhouse. Sunlight filtered through the tulip poplars in shifting green patterns, and the creek behind the house continued to move as a narrow, nearly silent ribbon between the stones. Caleb Morgan inspected it each morning, though he told himself the visits were only part of evaluating the property. The deep sound beneath the drainage pipe had not returned. June Foster had gone back to town with her empty pie dish and several unanswered questions, leaving Caleb alone with 3 German shepherds, a damaged house, and the uncomfortable possibility that something below the ground did not fit any explanation he trusted. He began with the porch. Work was easier than wondering. Caleb removed rotten boards, marked the strongest joists, and built a temporary barrier around the collapsed corner. He worked with a measured efficiency that had once made him valuable in places where hesitation could cost lives. Every tool returned to the same position. Every nail was counted. Every cut was checked twice. The mother German shepherd watched from beneath the shade of an oak tree, her lean body always angled toward the puppies. She still refused to let Caleb touch her, but she no longer growled each time he crossed the yard. She had begun eating while he remained nearby, though she swallowed quickly and carried part of every meal beneath the porch, as if preparing for the day when food stopped arriving. The lively puppy treated the construction area as a personal amusement park. The tiny German shepherd stole pencils, attacked the loose end of Caleb's measuring tape, and once climbed into an empty tool bucket only to discover that getting out required more intelligence than getting in. The quieter puppy preferred the kitchen. It slept beneath the old table, followed Caleb from room to room at a cautious distance, and continued pressing one folded ear against the floorboards whenever the house grew still. On the 3rd afternoon, Caleb drove all 3 dogs to a veterinary clinic outside Ellijay. The mother resisted the truck until Caleb placed both puppies inside first. Even then, she entered only after circling the vehicle twice and testing the running board with one paw. Dr. Naomi Price examined them in a quiet room at the back of the clinic. Naomi was 58, medium height with a solid build, deep brown skin, and silver-threaded black hair gathered into a low braid. Fine lines framed alert hazel eyes that seemed capable of noticing both an animal's pain and a human's dishonesty. She wore navy scrubs beneath a faded denim jacket and spoke in an even voice shaped by 30 years of handling frightened animals and impatient owners. Early in her career, Naomi had been bitten badly by an abused dog whose warning signals another veterinarian had ignored. The scar along her right wrist remained visible, and the experience had made her slower to touch, quicker to observe, and unwilling to confuse force with authority. The mother German shepherd stood rigid between the examination table and her puppies. Naomi did not reach for her. Instead, she sat on a low stool, turned slightly sideways, and waited. "You can learn a great deal about fear by noticing what it protects," Naomi said. Caleb leaned against the wall. "She protects everything." "That usually means everything has been taken before." The examination confirmed that the mother was approximately 4 years old. She was underweight but not critically ill. The scar across her shoulder was old, while patches of damaged fur around the neck suggested she had once worn a chain or narrow collar for long periods. Naomi found evidence that the dog had produced more than one litter. The puppies were close to 7 weeks old. Both were mildly dehydrated and undernourished, but their hearts and lungs sounded healthy. The lively puppy attempted to chew Naomi's stethoscope. The quieter one remained pressed against its mother until Naomi placed a folded towel over part of the table, creating a small, protected space. "They've survived because she kept them alive," Naomi said. "That doesn't mean she trusts you." "I didn't say she did." "You said stay to her 6 times since you came in." Caleb glanced at the mother dog. "She stayed?" Naomi's expression softened without becoming amused. "Obedience and trust are not the same thing, Mr. Morgan. Sometimes an animal stays because it has learned that moving makes things worse." The words struck with an accuracy Caleb resented. For years, people had praised his discipline without asking how much fear lived beneath it. He had followed orders, held positions, and remained calm because remaining useful had once been the safest way to exist. Naomi had been speaking about a dog, yet Caleb felt as if she had opened a door he had nailed shut. The clinic needed names for the records. Caleb hesitated. He had avoided naming the dogs because names created the dangerous illusion of permanence. He looked at the mother's guarded brown eyes. Rosie. Naomi entered it into the chart. The lively puppy had discovered a cardboard box and was trying to drag it beneath a chair. Buddy. The quiet puppy sat near the wall, listening to the hum of the building's air system. Lily. Naomi wrote the third name and glanced at him. Temporary? That's the plan. Plans are often just wishes wearing boots. On the drive home, Buddy slept upside down against the passenger door. Lily curled beside Rosie, while Rosie remained alert through every turn. Caleb listened to their breathing and felt the truck cabin become occupied in a way that was not entirely unpleasant. He reminded himself that Melissa Carter's rescue center would eventually take them. He repeated the thought until it began to sound less like a plan and more like an argument. That evening, Linda called while Caleb was replacing warped boards inside the kitchen. Her wedding anniversary was in 2 weeks, and she wanted him to return to Virginia for a small family dinner. "I'm in the middle of repairing the porch," Caleb said. "The porch will survive 1 weekend. The roof may not." Linda was silent for several seconds. "You know, every time something becomes personal, you suddenly discover urgent carpentry. I bought a damaged house. You bought a hiding place and gave it a project schedule." Caleb tightened his grip on the phone.
I'm not discussing this.
That's usually how you end discussions that are getting close to the truth. He disconnected the call before anger could turn into something worse. The kitchen became painfully quiet. Caleb set the phone on the counter harder than necessary, then shoved a pry bar beneath a loose wall panel. The wood split with a sharp crack. Rosie immediately rose from the doorway and guided both puppies into the next room. Buddy obeyed without protest. Lily looked back once before disappearing behind her mother. Caleb remained still, the pry bar in his hand. The dogs had not feared the noise. They had feared what the noise had revealed in him. He resumed the work more slowly. Behind the loosened panel was a narrow cavity between 2 studs. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, dry despite the dampness elsewhere on the wall. Caleb carried it to the table and unfolded the stiff material. The bundle contained more than 20 cassette tapes, 3 thin notebooks, several folded maps, and a stack of yellowed index cards. Each tape bore a date written in dark blue ink. The notebooks contained rainfall totals, creek measurements, temperature changes, and brief observations about cracks appearing in the hillside. Some entries went back more than 30 years. Every page was signed with the initials E.B., Evelyn Bellamy. Caleb arranged the material by date. The maps showed hand-drawn lines crossing the ridge, several of them converging near the blocked drainage pipe June had identified. One cassette had been kept separate from the others inside a waxed envelope. Its label read, August 17th, 1992. Ring the bell, anyway. An old cassette player remained on a shelf in the front room. Caleb cleaned the battery terminals, inserted fresh batteries from his toolbox, and placed the tape inside. Static filled the room. Then a woman's voice emerged, low, tired, and severe. 3 days of rain, Evelyn Bellamy said. But the creek has stopped moving. Water does not disappear. It is being held somewhere above us. Caleb leaned closer to the machine. Across the room, Lily lowered herself beside the wall. The small German shepherd pressed one ear against the floorboards and listened. Rain returned in thin, patient bands over the Blue Ridge Mountains, tapping against the repaired section of roof and darkening the forest around the farmhouse. Caleb Morgan spent most of the morning at the kitchen table with Evelyn Bellamy's cassette tapes arranged by date. Rosie rested near the doorway with Buddy tucked against her side, while Lily lay beneath the table, one folded ear angled toward the floor. The recordings had survived more than 3 decades inside the wall, but the woman speaking through them sounded less like a ghost than someone who had simply stepped into another room and expected to be answered. Caleb began with the earliest tapes from the summer of 1992. Evelyn's voice was precise, impatient, and almost entirely without warmth. She recorded rainfall totals, creek depth, soil movement, and the condition of stone channels running down from the upper ridge. At first, the entries resembled the work of a careful amateur meteorologist. Then the measurements began to change. After several days of rain, the creek behind the farmhouse rose, slowed, and finally dropped, despite water continuing to fall across the mountain. On one tape, Evelyn described hiking to the upper drainage line and finding it blocked by storm debris. Fallen branches had collected against a newly built livestock fence, while loose soil and stones had sealed part of an old culvert farther downhill. Evelyn believed water was accumulating in a natural hollow above the lower valley. She had telephoned the county road office, the sheriff's department, and several landowners. Her notes recorded the responses with bitter accuracy. No crew available, no verified emergency, no reason to trust measurements taken with jars, wooden stakes, and a kitchen ruler. They want a machine to tell them what the mountain has already said, Evelyn declared on one tape. People will ignore a woman with mud on her boots until the mud reaches their own door. Caleb understood her anger. He also recognized the danger inside it. Evelyn did not merely believe others were wrong. She seemed to need their doubt to prove her superior judgment. Her recordings became sharper as the weather worsened. She insulted officials, mocked neighbors, and dismissed anyone who asked her to explain the danger without accusation. June Foster arrived shortly before noon carrying a cardboard box filled with photocopied newspaper pages. Her silver curls were flattened beneath a rain scarf, and her green cardigan had been replaced by a mustard-colored raincoat that made her look, in Caleb's private opinion, like a determined piece of road equipment. "You listened to them?" June asked. "Most of them." "And?" She saw something everyone else missed. June removed the wet scarf. "That isn't the same as saying she was easy to believe." They compared the tapes with old articles. On August 17, 1992, Evelyn had rung the iron bell continuously during an afternoon storm. Several families living near the creek left their homes after hearing it. Others stayed, convinced that Evelyn was exaggerating another weather concern. A few hours later, water broke through the weakened slope. The surge destroyed a wooden bridge, carried away 2 barns, damaged 9 houses, and buried sections of the valley road beneath mud and timber. No one died. The newspapers credited emergency workers, fortunate timing, and neighbors who helped one another evacuate. Evelyn's name appeared mainly in stories about confusion. Some residents claimed the bell had created unnecessary panic. Others accused her of waiting too long before warning them. The contradiction did not matter. After the water receded, the town wanted a clean explanation for a disaster made from dozens of small failures. Evelyn, solitary and combative, became easier to blame than weather, neglected infrastructure, and shared inattention. Caleb listened to another tape, expecting to hear vindication. Instead, he heard Evelyn arguing with her daughter. Grace Bellamy's younger voice came faintly through the recording. She was asking whether Evelyn would attend a school music recital in Atlanta. Evelyn replied that the ridge was unstable and she could not leave her instruments unattended. Grace reminded her that the recital had been scheduled for months. People in the valley could lose everything, Evelyn said. I'm not asking for everything, Grace answered. I'm asking for one evening. Evelyn ended the conversation by turning back to rainfall measurements. The recorder remained running. For nearly a minute, nothing could be heard except rain against the windows. Then a door closed. Caleb stopped the tape. There were more moments like that. Evelyn missed Grace's graduation celebration because a storm was forecast. She referred to her daughter's marriage as poorly timed. In one recording, Evelyn complained that Grace had become selfish after moving away. The accusation sounded particularly cruel because Evelyn had spent years placing the entire mountain ahead of the child who still wanted her attention. Caleb looked at his phone. Linda had called twice that morning. He turned the device face down. June watched him but said nothing. Her restraint was more irritating than advice would have been. I found Grace, June finally said. She lives near Greenville now. She agreed to come. You contacted her before asking me? The tapes belonged to her mother. They were hidden in my house. June's brown eyes hardened. Ownership and understanding are not always the same thing. Grace Bellamy arrived that afternoon in a dark green sedan. At 67, she was tall and slender, with pale, freckled skin and auburn hair faded almost entirely to silver, cut in a straight line below her jaw. Her face retained the fine bones visible in an old newspaper photograph June had brought, but age and restraint had deepened the lines around her gray eyes. Grace wore a charcoal raincoat, low leather shoes, and no jewelry except a narrow wedding band, though her husband had died 6 years earlier. She had worked for 4 decades as a music teacher, a profession that suited her quiet patience but concealed a temper she had spent years learning not to fear. Growing up with Evelyn had taught Grace that anger spoken loudly could fill an entire house, while anger swallowed could remain for generations. She paused on the porch beneath the cracked bell. My mother used to polish that thing, Grace said. She never polished the kitchen silver. Inside, Caleb explained where he had found the tapes. Grace did not ask whether the land, house, or recordings legally belonged to her. She only asked to hear her mother's voice. Caleb played the tape containing the flood warning. Evelyn described the blocked drainage line and the danger below. Grace listened without moving. When the recording ended, June said quietly, "She may have saved lives." Grace turned toward her. That is what people prefer now, isn't it? The difficult woman nobody believed becomes a hero after she can no longer correct the story. June flinched. Grace walked to the table and touched one of the notebooks. My mother could recognize a half-inch change in a creek from 50 yards away. She could not recognize when her own daughter had stopped asking her to come home. Buddy wandered toward Grace and sniffed the hem of her raincoat. Grace bent instinctively, extending one hand. Rosie rose with a low growl and stepped between Grace and both puppies. Caleb straightened, ready to intervene. Grace withdrew her hand immediately. She moved backward, lowered herself carefully onto the dusty floor, and turned her face away from Rosie. My mother hated backing down, Grace said. I learned early that sometimes it is the kindest thing a person can do. Rosie remained tense, but the growl faded. After several moments, Buddy approached Grace again. Lily stayed beside her mother, watching. Grace reached into her handbag and removed a small rusted key attached to a faded blue ribbon. She placed it in Caleb's palm. It opens my mother's old weather station, she said. It is farther up the ridge, beyond the second stone crossing. I haven't been there since I was 34. Grace looked toward the silent cassette player. Her voice softened, but the hurt inside it did not. My mother rang that bell for the whole town, but she never listened when I told her I needed her. Caleb said nothing. His phone lit up on the table, 3 missed calls from Linda. He watched the screen go dark. He did not call her back. The morning after Grace Bellamy returned, the rain lifted from the Blue Ridge Mountains and left the forest washed clean, every leaf bright beneath a pale sky. Caleb Morgan stood on the porch with Evelyn's rusted key in his palm, while Rosie watched him from the yard. Buddy had found a length of rotten bell rope and was dragging it through the mud with the solemn pride of a hunter carrying home a stag. Lily sat beside the steps, head tilted toward the ridge, as though some distant sound had already told her where they were going. Grace arrived shortly after sunrise, in hiking boots that looked new but carefully chosen. Her silvered auburn hair was tied back at the nape of her neck, and the dark green jacket she wore had belonged to her late husband. She had kept it because its pockets still contained 2 peppermint wrappers and a hardware store receipt from the last winter of his life. Grace did not mention that detail. She simply touched one pocket before looking toward the mountain. June Foster came next, carrying a walking stick, a canvas satchel, and enough food for what she called a brief expedition, though the satchel appeared capable of feeding a search party for several days. Her silver curls were covered by a red bandana, and her sturdy boots were scarred from years of walking rural mail routes. "You brought pie?" Caleb asked. "Sandwiches." "That wasn't my question." June gave him a flat look. "The pie was eaten by people who asked fewer questions." The old weather station lay beyond the second stone crossing, nearly a mile above the farmhouse. Caleb led at first, moving with the automatic caution of a man who still scanned tree lines and studied disturbed soil. Grace followed more slowly, recognizing parts of the path that had been buried beneath 30 years of growth. June refused Caleb's offer to carry her satchel. Rosie ranged between them and the trees, never moving far from the puppies. Buddy repeatedly disappeared into ferns and returned decorated with leaves. Lily stayed close to the old drainage stones, occasionally stopping to sniff the damp ground. At the first crossing, Grace rested one hand on a moss-covered boulder. "My mother made me haul rain gauges up this trail when I was 12, she said. "I wanted to take piano lessons. She said weather was more useful." "Did you take the lessons?" June asked. "Eventually. I paid for them by cleaning the church." Caleb heard no self-pity in Grace's voice. That made the hurt feel older, not smaller. The station appeared beyond a stand of hemlocks, a narrow wooden structure leaning against the slope, half hidden by mountain laurel. One wall had collapsed inward, and a rusted metal mast rose above the roof without its instruments. Grace stopped several yards away. For a moment, she was not a retired music teacher or a composed widow. She was a daughter standing before a place that had received more of her mother's attention than she ever had. Caleb inserted the key into the swollen door. It resisted twice before turning. Inside, dust lay thick over a workbench, shelves, glass jars, and a wooden chair. The air smelled of paper, mildew, and old cedar. June opened the shutters while Caleb checked the weak floorboards. Grace remained near the doorway until Buddy trotted inside and sneezed so violently that he startled himself backward into a bucket. The noise broke the room's spell. Grace laughed once, quietly, then entered. They found rain gauges, notebooks ruined by moisture, lengths of marked copper wire, and jars filled with soil samples. On the rear wall hung a county topographic map covered with Evelyn's blue and red pencil lines. Much of it was hidden beneath a sheet of oilcloth nailed across the frame. Caleb pulled the nails and lowered the covering. The complete drainage system appeared beneath it. Stone channels descended from 3 points along the ridge. 2 merged near the blocked pipe Rosie had discovered. A third, wider ditch crossed a property line marked Harper, curved around a natural basin, and emptied into the creek behind Caleb's farmhouse. Beside the Harper section, Evelyn had written, "Ditch filled, October 1988. Pasture expansion. Natural basin now has no secondary release." Farther up the map, a red circle surrounded a shallow depression between 2 ridges. Another note read, "If western culvert closes, water collects here. Saturated slope may fail toward lower road." Caleb traced the lines with one finger. The blocked pipe alone was not the entire problem. It was one part of a network that had lost its safest routes downhill. Grace found a folder wedged behind the map. Inside were photographs showing a broad stone ditch running through an open field. Later photographs showed the same land covered with packed soil and grass.
That was Harold Harper's pasture, Grace said. May's father.
June nodded slowly. The cattle kept breaking legs near the ditch. Harold filled it so he could use the whole field.
Did he know what it did?
Caleb asked. Probably not, Grace said. Evelyn never explained anything before accusing people. After the flood, she told everyone Harold had buried the mountain's warning. Grace's mouth tightened. People repeated it until it became simpler than the truth. By noon, Caleb had copied the map, measured the marked distances, and produced a practical plan. They would inspect the Harper ditch, locate the buried channel, clear the vegetation, and reopen enough of it to restore flow before another prolonged storm. June studied his notes. You might begin by asking May. I'll explain what needs to happen. That sentence does not contain the word ask. May Harper lived south of the ridge, in a white clapboard house surrounded by apple trees and split-rail fencing. At 74, May was a broad-hipped, straight-backed woman with weathered, fair skin, steel blue eyes, and thick white hair braided over one shoulder. She wore denim overalls over a faded violet shirt and held a pruning knife in one square, capable hand. May had run the family orchard alone since her husband's death 18 years earlier. Years of being underestimated by bankers, equipment dealers, and distant relatives had sharpened her independence into something that could resemble hostility at close range. Caleb introduced himself and unfolded the copied map on her porch rail. This drainage line crosses your north pasture, he said. It needs to be reopened before the next major storm. May looked at the map, then at him. Needs to be? The old channel provided a secondary release from the basin. We'll need access for inspection, and depending on the condition, machinery. We? I can organize the work. On my land. It affects the entire lower valley. Caleb heard his own tone becoming firmer, the one that had once made frightened men move without discussion. May's expression cooled with every sentence. You came to my porch, she said, with a dead woman's map and a soldier's voice, and decided my answer before learning the question. This isn't personal. May's face changed. That is what people say when the personal cost belongs to somebody else. She stepped inside and closed the door before Caleb finished explaining the danger. On the walk back, Buddy slipped through a gap in May's fence and vanished toward the porch. Caleb turns to retrieve him, but May opened the door first. She claimed she disliked dogs, called Buddy a muddy nuisance, and sent him back carrying half a biscuit in his mouth. Beside her porch chair sat a clean bowl filled with water. Grace waited until they reached the trees before speaking. Harold Harper had died believing the flood was his fault. Evelyn's public accusations had followed May through school meetings, church suppers, and every local conversation about the disaster. June struck the path with her walking stick. You cannot repair an old wound by marching into it and giving orders. Caleb did not answer. The worst part was that June was right, and being right did not make her pleasant. That evening, as darkness settled around the farmhouse, someone knocked at the open door. May stood outside holding a brass gate key. She entered, placed it on the kitchen table, and looked from Caleb to Grace and June. You may inspect the ditch, May said, but I have one condition. Nobody tells this story as if Evelyn Bellamy was the only person who was right, and my father was the only person who was wrong. Caleb looked at the key. Every instinct urged him to add terms, control the schedule, and define the work. Instead, he said, agreed. For the first time in years, Caleb accepted a plan whose shape did not belong entirely to him. Late summer pressed heavily over the Blue Ridge Mountains, turning the afternoons bright and airless, while dark clouds gathered beyond the western ridges. The Weather Service predicted that a slow-moving, low-pressure system would reach northern Georgia before midnight, bringing several inches of rain to already softened ground. County instruments showed no immediate danger. The creek gauges remained below alert level, the automated rainfall stations reported ordinary totals, and no warning had been issued for the lower valley. Rosie did not care what the instruments said. For 3 evenings, the adult German shepherd had carried Buddy and Lily into the farmhouse before sunset. Buddy protested each trip by twisting in his mother's grip until his oversized paws struck the doorframe. Lily remained quiet, but once inside she lay flat against the kitchen floor and listened. Rosie then moved from window to window, checking the forest with the tense concentration of an animal expecting something to arrive, before everyone else noticed it coming. Caleb Morgan had begun sleeping in the upstairs bedroom after repairing the ceiling, yet he woke each night to the scrape of Rosie's claws below. He kept telling himself the dog was reacting to distant thunder or changing pressure. The explanation sounded reasonable until he walked behind the farmhouse and saw how low the creek had become. The stones that had been underwater a week earlier now stood exposed, dark and slick beneath a thread of moving water. That alone would not have alarmed him during dry weather. The problem was that rain had already begun falling heavily on the upper ridge. June's portable gauge showed nearly 2 inches in the previous 36 hours. Water should have been moving downhill. Instead, the creek seemed to be emptying. Caleb called May Harper shortly after breakfast. By mid-morning, May arrived in her faded pickup, wearing denim overalls, a straw hat, and the expression of a woman who had already decided the weather was personally inconvenient. Grace Bellamy came carrying Evelyn's copied maps in a waterproof tube. June Foster followed with her canvas satchel, red reading glass cord, and a small notebook filled with figures written in tight, careful rows. "You all look too serious," May said. "That usually means somebody expects me to climb something." "Only your north pasture," Caleb replied. "That is still uphill." They entered through the gate May had opened for them and followed the buried drainage line across the field. Weeks earlier, Caleb had marked its probable course using Evelyn's map, old photographs, and the remaining stones near the tree line. Now, several depressions had formed across the pasture. One section had sunk almost a foot, leaving a narrow crack in the grass where damp red clay showed beneath the roots. Caleb tested the ground with a steel probe. The rod entered easily for nearly 4 feet before striking stone. When he withdrew it, the lower half was wet. May watched him closely. "Water?" "Probably." "Probably is doing a lot of work in that answer." The old channel had not simply filled with soil. Part of it had collapsed inward, forming a barrier beneath the pasture. Caleb could identify where water might be collecting, but he could not determine how much pressure had developed farther uphill. Opening the wrong section too quickly could send water and debris across May's orchard or destabilize the slope. Grace studied the photographs of the original ditch. "My mother would have dug into it immediately." "Your mother once tried to repair a lightning rod during a thunderstorm," May said. "That is not the recommendation you think it is." Grace almost smiled. The exchange held no forgiveness, but it contained less bitterness than before. June knelt beside the crack and pressed 2 fingers into the mud. "This soil is wetter than it was yesterday." Caleb looked toward the upper ridge. Clouds had begun folding over the peaks in dark layers. He called the county emergency management office from May's Porch, where the signal was stronger. The call was answered by Marcus Reed, a 45-year-old emergency planning officer with a lean frame, close-cropped sandy hair, and a narrow face made sharper by years of poor sleep. Marcus spoke carefully and rarely interrupted. 5 years earlier, he had recommended evacuating a rural neighborhood during a storm that changed course. The residents returned to undamaged homes and spent months accusing the county of overreacting. Since then, Marcus had become cautious almost to the point of paralysis, demanding official measurements before making any recommendation that might disrupt hundreds of lives. Caleb described the falling creek level, the collapsed channel, Evelyn's drainage maps, and Rosie's behavior. "I can document the physical changes," Marcus said, "but I cannot recommend evacuation based on a historic map and animal behavior. The upper ridge has received 2 inches already. Our stations show less than 1. Your nearest station is 6 miles east." "I understand that." "No, you understand the number. That isn't the same thing." Marcus remained quiet before answering. "Send photographs and coordinates. I'll request a field inspection, but I cannot promise anyone before tomorrow morning." The main system arrives tonight." "I know." The call ended with neither man satisfied. Caleb's first instinct was immediate and familiar. He would climb to the natural basin alone, locate the obstruction, measure the water level, and return before darkness. He began loading rope, a headlamp, survey stakes, and a folding shovel into his pack. Rosie watched from the porch.
Lily lay beside the bellpost. Buddy was attempting to steal May's hat. Grace recognized the pack. "Where are you going?" "Up a basin." "With whom?" "I'll move faster alone." The sentence pulled Caleb backward into another night years earlier, far from Georgia. His team had been waiting for support while an injured civilian remained trapped beyond a damaged structure. Caleb had believed delay would place everyone at greater risk. He had gone ahead without waiting for the second team. The route had been less stable than he calculated, and one of his closest teammates, Aaron Mills, had followed to cover him. Aaron suffered a serious leg injury when part of the passage collapsed. He survived and later told Caleb that the mistake was not caring too much. The mistake was believing care gave Caleb the right to decide everyone else's risk. Caleb had spent years converting that memory into stricter plans, more control, and fewer opportunities for uncertainty. He had never admitted that control had begun as guilt wearing a uniform. He slowly removed the pack. "I need someone who knows the old path," he said. Grace nodded. "I do." "And someone who knows where the pasture drains." May folded her arms. "That would be me." June lifted her walking stick. "I assume my role is to point out when all three of you are being foolish?" Caleb looked at them and felt the discomfort of depending on people who could refuse him. For once, he accepted it. Before they left, he stepped inside and called Linda. She answered on the second ring. "I bought the house to disappear," Caleb said without greeting. "Not to start over. I thought if no one knew where I was, no one could need anything from me." Linda's silence was gentle rather than empty. "I know." "I should have said it earlier." "You should have," she replied, "but saying it now still counts." He told her about the weather and promised to call again. Linda did not ask him to return to Virginia. She only said, "Do not use being alone as proof that you do not need anyone." In the kitchen, Grace and June spread Evelyn's 1992 notebooks beside the current rainfall figures. The old entries showed the same pattern: rising rain totals, falling creek depth, and increasing ground moisture near the farmhouse. The dates were different. The sequence was not. Rosie suddenly rushed onto the porch and began digging beneath the post supporting the cracked bell. Dirt and splinters flew between her hind legs. Caleb pulled up one loose board and aimed his flashlight into the gap. Red-brown water pushed upward through the soil in slow, pulsing bubbles. The drainage system was not merely blocked. Pressure was forcing water backward beneath the house. Beyond the ridge, thunder rolled for the first time. The main storm was still several hours away. The first rain reached Birch Hollow as a scatter of cold drops against the porch roof. But within 20 minutes the forest had disappeared behind a gray curtain. Water drummed on the shingles Caleb Morgan had only recently repaired, ran in silver sheets from the eaves, and gathered beneath the cracked iron bell where Rosie had exposed the red-brown seepage. The water rising through the soil no longer appeared in slow bubbles. It pulsed upward with each distant roll of thunder, carrying clay, leaves, and the sour mineral smell of earth disturbed under pressure. Caleb photographed the opening, marked the depth against the porch post, and sent the images to Marcus Reed. Then he called the Birch Hollow Volunteer Fire Department rather than waiting for the county to decide whether the evidence had become official enough to matter. The first truck arrived 18 minutes later, its faded red paint flashing between the trees. It was driven by Thomas Hale, the 61-year-old volunteer fire chief, a broad, heavy-chested man with close-cut white hair, a square face, and a gray mustache yellowed slightly at one corner from years of chewing unlit cigars. Thomas had operated a grading company before arthritis forced him away from full-time machinery work. A barn fire that killed 2 horses on his family's property when he was 17 had shaped his habit of arriving early, checking twice,
and never mocking fear merely because it had not yet become disaster. He spoke slowly, disliked dramatic language, and treated every person on a scene as useful until proven otherwise. Thomas crouched beside the opened porch board while rain soaked the shoulders of his canvas coat. "That is groundwater pushing the wrong direction. That's what I told the county," Caleb said. Thomas looked toward the ridge. "County needs forms. Water doesn't." Two firefighters followed him to May Harper's pasture and inspected the collapsed channel. They agreed to begin notifying families on the lower road and to position vehicles near the church hall, the highest public building in the valley. They could recommend that residents leave, Thomas explained, but only county officials could issue a formal evacuation order. "How long will that take?" Caleb asked. Thomas glanced at the darkening sky. "Longer than the mountain appears willing to wait." Grace Bellamy and June Foster had already transformed Caleb's kitchen into a temporary command table. Evelyn's maps lay beneath sheets of clear plastic. June used an old telephone directory to circle the names of elderly residents, families without vehicles, and homes located below the washed-out bridge site from 1992. Grace compared each address against the drainage lines, while May stood near the back door, soaked to the skin and refusing every towel offered to her. The rain intensified. A low tremor passed beneath the kitchen floor, rattling 2 cups in the sink. Lily lifted her head immediately. Rosie seized Buddy gently by the scruff and carried him into the front room, then returned for Lily. Caleb watched the mother dog complete the same task she had repeated every evening, except now no one could dismiss the behavior as nervous instinct. Thomas radioed from May's pasture. The ground above the buried ditch had dropped another 6 inches. A county inspection crew was still at least an hour away. Caleb stepped onto the porch. The iron bell hung above him, black with rain, its old crack running from the lower rim halfway toward the crown. Evelyn had once pulled that rope alone. Some people had listened. Others had called her frightened, arrogant, or unstable. When the flood came, the same town that had ignored her decided she had warned them incorrectly. Caleb reached for the rope, then stopped. If he rang it alone and the hillside held, the bell would become evidence that another outsider had panicked. If the hillside failed, people would remember only that one man had decided for everyone. The problem was not simply whether the warning was correct. The problem was allowing one person to carry all the certainty, all the blame, and all the consequences. Grace stood in the doorway behind him. Rain blew across her silvered auburn hair and darkened the shoulders of her jacket. "My mother never asked anyone to stand beside her," Grace said. "Would you have?" Grace looked at the bell. "Not then." Caleb held out the frayed rope. "What about now?" Grace did not take it immediately. Her hand hovered between them while 30 years of anger seemed to move across her face. Anger at Evelyn, at the town, and at the younger version of herself who had needed to choose between defending her mother and protecting herself. Finally, Grace wrapped both hands around the rope. Caleb gripped the loose end beside hers. Together, they pulled. The bell's first note came out cracked and ugly. It was not a heroic sound. It shuddered across the wet trees like iron being dragged over stone. They pulled again. The second strike carried farther, down the slope and toward the lower road. June began calling names from the directory. She did not say the town was doomed. She said the old drainage system was failing, the fire department was moving people uphill, and anyone who needed help should leave now rather than later. May unlocked both gates to her north pasture, allowing Thomas's truck and a borrowed excavator to cross the orchard. People arrived slowly, then all at once. A retired logger brought 2 chainsaws. 3 farmers came with shovels and mattocks. A mechanic drove an aging backhoe through May's open gate. No one waited to decide whose theory deserved credit. They followed the exposed stones, cut away roots, and removed sections of collapsed clay, while Thomas directed the machinery from stable ground. Caleb joined the line with a shovel. His instincts kept offering orders, but he forced himself to ask questions instead. May knew where the pasture remained firm. Thomas understood how far the excavator could approach without sinking. Grace read Evelyn's measurements. June tracked the residents who had reached the church hall. Caleb contributed without making himself the center of every decision. At the hall, Rosie refused to cross the crowded threshold. Voices, wet coats, moving chairs, and frightened children filled the room. The mother German shepherd planted her feet outside, keeping Buddy and Lily behind her. An earlier version of Caleb would have tightened a leash and pulled. Instead, he cleared a space beside the open side door, moved 2 folding tables into a partial barrier, and placed blankets and water inside the quiet corner. Rosie entered only after Buddy did. She circled twice, settled around both puppies, and turned her back toward Caleb. The gesture would have looked insignificant to anyone else. Caleb understood what it meant. Rosie trusted him enough to stop watching. Grace and June stood nearby while rain hammered the metal roof. Grace spoke without looking at June. "I believed my mother in 1992. At least part of me did." June lowered the telephone list. "Why didn't you say so?" "Because I was angry. She had missed my recital, my graduation dinner, almost every moment that mattered. Defending her would have felt like saying none of that counted." June swallowed. "I knew the town was being unfair after the flood. I stayed quiet because people were tired and angry, and I did not want them angry with me." Grace's expression did not soften. "Thank you for saying it." It was not forgiveness. June did not ask for more. They returned to the pasture and worked beside each other in the rain. Near dusk, the excavator broke through the collapsed section of channel. Nothing happened for 1 terrible second. Then water burst from beneath the clay in a roaring brown wall. Thomas shouted for everyone to move back. The reopened ditch filled instantly, carrying branches, stones, and decades of packed earth across May's lower field. The current tore through her winter garden, flattened the split-rail fence, and swept young apple saplings from the lowest row. May watched without turning away. Below the pasture, the restored channel curved toward the creek and carried the flood past the lower houses. Mud reached several yards. One empty shed collapsed. No homes were swept away. No one died. By nightfall, the rain softened. Families remained at the church until Thomas declared the lower road safe enough for careful travel. Caleb returned to the farmhouse with Grace, June, May, and the 3 German shepherds. As they stepped onto the porch, a final gust moved through the trees. The bell sounded once. A fresh crack split along its weathered side. Grace placed her palm against the cold iron. "This time," she said, "it didn't have to ring alone." The 6 months after the storm carried Bertalo through the red leaves of autumn, the first white frost, Thanksgiving, and the quiet gray weeks of winter. By February, the farmhouse in the Blue Ridge Mountains no longer looked abandoned. Caleb Morgan had replaced the weakest roof beams, repaired the upstairs windows, rebuilt the porch steps, and painted the weathered siding a soft slate blue. Yet he had not erased everything Evelyn Bellamy had left behind. The water level marks remained on the kitchen wall, thin pencil lines beside handwritten dates. One mark rose almost to the window ledge. Caleb had cleaned around it rather than painting over it. A home, he had decided, did not become new by pretending nothing difficult had ever happened inside it. The cracked iron bell still hung above the porch. Thomas Hale had reinforced the mounting beam and fitted a narrow steel band around the bell's crown. But Grace refused to let anyone melt the iron and recast it. "A new bell would sound better," Thomas had said. "That is exactly why we should keep this one," Grace replied. The old bell's uneven voice had become part of Birch Hollow's new warning system. The town council established a community weather group made up of volunteer firefighters, farmers, older residents, and anyone willing to complete basic emergency training. Marcus Reed installed 2 digital rain gauges near the upper ridge and a groundwater sensor beside the restored drainage ditch. June Foster insisted that mechanical instruments were only one part of the system. Handwritten rainfall records, observations from residents, changes in creek flow, and unusual animal behavior were also documented. No machine gets to be the only expert, June said at the first meeting. Neither does any person. Caleb agreed more easily than he would have 6 months earlier.
Evelyn's cassette tapes, notebooks, and maps were transferred to the local library, where June arranged them in archival boxes. Grace helped identify voices, dates, and locations. The two women began recording interviews with people who remembered the 1992 flood. Their work was not comfortable. Some residents praised Evelyn as a visionary. Others remembered her as insulting, impatient, and nearly impossible to approach. Grace refused to remove either version. "My mother warned people correctly," she told one elderly farmer. "She also hurt people who loved her. Both statements can remain true." June recorded the sentence without offering comfort. She had learned that honest history sometimes required leaving contradictions unresolved. The new archive described Evelyn's courage, her arrogance, the officials who dismissed her, the neighbors who helped one another, and the families who remained angry long after the water receded. It did not turn her into a saint. It did not reduce her to a troublemaker. For Grace, that balance became a form of peace, though not forgiveness in the simple sense. She still paused before entering the weather station. She still became quiet when the old tapes captured her younger voice. Healing did not remove the abandoned child from the older woman. It merely gave that child a place to speak. On a bright October morning, Dr. Naomi Price returned to the farmhouse with adoption forms. Rosie stood beside Caleb while Buddy attempted to climb into Naomi's open medical bag, and Lily watched the veterinarian from beneath the kitchen table. "You understand that signing these makes the arrangement official," Naomi said. Caleb looked at the 3 dogs. "It became official before anyone brought paperwork." Rosie remained lean but healthy, her black and tan coat now thick and glossy over the old scar on her shoulder. She still carried food away from the bowl on loud or unfamiliar days. Caleb no longer took the bowl from her or tried to stop the behavior. He placed a second dish in the quiet corner beneath the stairs and allowed her to decide where to eat. Buddy had grown into a long-legged German Shepherd puppy with enormous ears and very little respect for newly repaired property. He buried tools, gloves, and once an entire loaf of bread in places no reasonable creature would consider useful. Lily remained smaller and more reserved. Whenever the weather changed, she stretched flat across the kitchen floor and pressed one ear to the boards. Caleb recorded the behavior in the community weather log. He no longer called it foolish. May Harper rebuilt her lower garden with help from nearly everyone who had crossed her pasture during the storm. Thomas brought timber for new fencing. Marcus arranged erosion control material through the county. Grace planted herbs along the stone border, and June supervised while doing significantly less physical work than her advice suggested. Buddy participated by digging up 3 young blueberry bushes immediately after May planted them. May stood over the muddy puppy with both hands on her hips. "You are not a dog," she announced. "You are a 4-legged natural disaster." Buddy wagged his tail and removed a 4th bush. May complained for 20 minutes, then allowed him to sleep beside her porch chair. Linda arrived from Virginia for Thanksgiving. She stepped out of her car wearing a dark red wool coat, her chestnut hair streaked more heavily with gray than Caleb remembered. Linda stood in the yard for a moment, looking at the repaired house, the 3 German shepherds, and the collection of neighbors carrying food through the open front door. "You bought distance," she said. "It appears distance invited company." Caleb almost gave her an explanation. Instead, he took her suitcase. That evening, after the others had gone home, Caleb and Linda sat beneath blankets on the porch. Frost silvered the grass, and the forest breathed softly beyond the light from the windows. "I should have called more," Caleb said. Linda waited. "I used silence to punish people who never hurt me. I told myself I was protecting everyone from whatever was wrong with me. Really, I was making sure nobody could ask me to change." It was not a polished apology. Caleb did not explain every old injury or promise that he would never withdraw again. Linda rested both hands around her coffee mug. "Silence can be forgiven," she said. It just cannot become the only house a person agrees to live in.
Caleb nodded. Neither of them tried to improve the moment by saying more. By late winter, the community weather station was operating again. New electronic equipment stood beside Evelyn's glass gauges, wooden measuring stakes, and handwritten tables. The old and new instruments did not always agree. When they differed, people investigated, instead of choosing whichever answer felt easier. One mild afternoon, Grace, June, May, and Linda gathered on Caleb's porch after a weather group meeting. June poured coffee. May adjusted a wool blanket over her knees. Grace looked toward the ridge where sunlight moved through bare branches. Rosie lay beneath the porch table with Lily resting against one side and Buddy against the other. Buddy noticed the bell rope hanging above the steps. Before Caleb could reach him, the young German shepherd caught the rope between his teeth and pulled backward with all the determination of an animal certain he had discovered the world's finest toy. The cracked bell gave a crooked, startled clang across the forest. May looked toward the trees.
The town has been warned. A puppy storm is approaching from the south.
Everyone laughed, including Caleb. He left the rope where it was. The bell remained cracked. Rosie still guarded food when frightened. Lily still listened to the earth. Grace still carried anger beside love. June had not been forgiven for every year of silence. Caleb still woke some nights expecting danger. No one claimed that every wound had healed. The farmhouse door stood open behind them. Caleb did not leave it open because he had stopped fearing loss. He left it open because he finally understood that a home was not built from perfect silence. A home was built from imperfect voices allowed to speak, and from the people who chose to remain long enough to listen. Caleb thought peace meant finding a place where no one could reach him. But God's mercy often enters through the very door we try to close. It came through a wounded mother dog, 2 restless puppies, an old bell, and neighbors brave enough to listen before they understood everything. The miracle was not only that the town survived the storm. It was that people who carried old anger chose to stand beside one another. Grace did not have to pretend her mother had been perfect. May did not have to deny her father's mistake. Caleb did not have to become fearless before accepting love. Real healing does not erase every scar. Sometimes it teaches us that scars can remain without controlling the rest of our lives. In everyday life, we may not hear a warning bell, but we often notice a quiet change in someone we love. A shorter answer, an unanswered call, a silence that feels heavier than usual. Perhaps God is asking us not to fix everything, but simply to listen and stay. Share this story with someone who needs hope, and tell us in the comments what message touched you most. Please subscribe for more stories like this. May God protect your home, strengthen your heart, and place faithful people beside you when the storms arrive.